All right, guys. Hi, this is Mrs. Allgood. We're going to try this video lecture thing again. I had wanted to show you a little clip of this video showing how petals have these little UV patterns on them, but apparently that was copyrighted by the BBC and YouTube blocked my video. And after exploring a whole lot of other options, it seems like re-recording is my only option. So let's go through this again. You'll need your angiosperm notes and your fruit notes because we're going to tackle them both in this video. So let's move on. All right, these are just some basics about angiosperms. There are 250,000 known species, over that really. They are contained in a single phylum, phylum Anthophyta. And remember that the thing that makes angiosperms different from gymnosperms is that in angiosperms, their ovules are going to be enclosed in an ovary. So once fertilization happens, those ovules are going to become the seeds. Okay? Alrighty. All right, let's keep moving. Okay, so today one of our main topics is to learn about flower structure. So at some point in your educational career, you've probably had to learn about the parts of a flower. If we were still in school together, we'd be doing a flower dissection for this, which sounds kind of cheesy, but it's actually kind of cool. Since we can't do that, and there's not many flowers blooming outside right now, we'll just have to hold off on that for the time being. Okay, so remember that the flower is the reproductive structure in angiosperms, and it's going to consist of 4 modified leaves or whorls, and those are sepals, petals, stamens, and carpels. So those are going to be the 4 main parts of a flower. So if we look at this picture, what we see in the middle is we see the carpel, which is the female part of the flower. It's got this stigma on top, which is a sticky surface for pollen to stick to, and then the style underneath that. And then this is the ovary, and these are ovules. So in your gymnosperm notes yesterday, we did see ovules. Okay, they were deep down within the scales in the pine cone. Okay, the difference was those ovules were not contained in an ovary. So that characteristic is unique to angiosperms. Of course, you've got petals, which we'll talk about today. You've got sepals. You've got stamens, which are the male parts of the flower. So we're going to talk about each one of those separately. Okay, so sepals are usually green, and they enclose the flower before it opens. So we've got, obviously the white things in this picture are the petals, but the green are the sepals. And so not every flower has sepals. That's just something that certain flowers have and some don't. For example, like your Easter lilies do not have sepals, but like a rose does. And it's one of those things you can count in addition to petals, in addition to stamens, to see if something is a monocot or dicot. So you've got, in this picture, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sepals, which is going to make this a dicot. Okay, then petals. This was the video clip that I can't show you or else YouTube will block it again. But petals are brightly colored in most flowers. You'll have an article to do either tomorrow or the next day with pollinators and their flowers. That kind of talks about how flowers and their pollinators sort of co-evolve together. Most flowers have brightly colored petals, and of course that's to attract insects and other pollinators. Flowers that rely on wind for pollination generally lack those bright colors, as do those that are pollinated at night. All right, let's take this little by little. Okay, first, we've got stamens. So you got to remember that stamens are the male part of the flower. okay? They're going to produce microspores that will give rise to the male gametophyte, or what we'll call the microgametophyte. So the male gametophyte or the microgametophyte in both gymnosperms and angiosperms is going to be your pollen grain. So a stamen is made up of two parts. It's made up of the filament, which is this stalk that you see there, and then the anther, which usually sort of has like a fuzzy appearance to it. The anther is where the pollen grains are made and stored, okay? So there's all your pollen grains right there. They're kind of collected on the anther. So you see that in this picture here. This would be the filament, and this would be the anther, and the name for that entire structure is the stamen. All right, let's move on to carpels. So a couple things about carpels is that they are the female reproductive organ in the flower. They produce megaspores that give rise to the female gametophyte. And we briefly mentioned yesterday that the female gametophyte is going to be the embryo sac. We didn't really dwell on that. We'll get into that a little bit more tomorrow. But there are 4 parts to the carpel, or sometimes you might hear the carpel called the pistil. There is a slight difference, but we're not going to really get into that. The stigma in something like an Easter lily is going to be a very prominent, obvious structure. It's not always that way. This is the carpel from a flower that we normally dissect called an alstroemeria that you can get at most grocery stores. This is the stigma of that flower. It's really not very easy to pick out. It's not very prominent. So it just depends on the flower species. And then the stalk that supports the stigma, that's the style. Okay, so we think about carpel being female. Females have style. No offense, guys. The style is what connects the stigma to the ovary. And this is going to be important in tomorrow's notes because we'll talk about how the pollen tube can travel down that style from the stigma where the pollen lands down to the ovary where the ovules are. Okay, so next, that's going to bring us to the ovary. The ovary is at the base of the carpel. It's what's going to become the fruit after fertilization. And then finally, you have the ovules. So I just basically colored them in white here in this picture. The ovules are going to become the seeds after fertilization. So keep in mind from yesterday that gymnosperms still used ovules. They just didn't have them contained within ovaries. All right, let's keep moving. I might be going a little faster this round because I already did it once today and I'm kind of tired. Okay, a couple other terms. You've got a receptacle, which is just this swelled region at the base of the flower. So notice that it's kind of like the anchor for a lot of the other flower parts. So the ovary is usually going to sit above it. You've got your petals there. You've got your sepals. And then the receptacle is typically a swelled region that's right below the sepals. And then the pedicel is just a fancy name for the stem. And again, if I ever go too fast, please just pause it. Okay, a little bit more terminology here. We're going to talk about complete versus incomplete flowers. So a complete flower is one that has all 4 whorls: sepals, petals, stamens, carpels. An incomplete flower is going to lack at least one of those structures. So, for example, an Easter lily usually doesn't have sepals, so an Easter lily would be an incomplete flower. Okay? So remember your difference between a complete and an incomplete flower. A perfect flower, on the other hand, is one that has both sexes. So that means that it has stamens and carpels in the same flower. And that's the kind of flower that we've been looking at as we've learned about the different flower parts. But I just want you to realize that not every plant out there has perfect flowers. Some have imperfect flowers. So we're going to see what that is on our next slide. So I'll tell you about my pictures at the top here. You don't have to draw those, but you certainly can. The M in the picture stands for male, like meaning flower with male parts, and the F here stands for female. So an imperfect flower is going to be a flower having only one sex. So that just means that it either has stamens or carpels, but not both. So what do we mean by that? Well, this picture, this is a plant, okay, and this is a flower. And if you notice, it has male and female parts in the same flower. So this would be, this flower would be a perfect flower, okay, because it has male and female parts in the same flower, okay. The other examples, this one on the left and these two on the right, these are plants that contain imperfect flowers. So there's two options of the kind of plants that could have that. This plant has a male flower and a female flower. Female flower, male flower, male flower, female flower. Okay? They basically have male and female flowers on the same plant. So the flower itself only has one sex in it. It either has male parts or female parts, but essentially you have male and female flowers on the same plant. Whereas over here, what you're seeing is we've got a plant that has only male flowers and then a plant that only has female flowers. So essentially you have male and female plants. So the reason I'm even showing that to you is because yes, we're talking about the flower here, but next we're going to talk about the term for the plant if it has male and female flowers on the same plant versus male and female flowers on separate plants. So, first we're going to look at something called a monoecious plant. Okay, so mono we know means one. So a monoecious plant has separate male and female flowers all located on the same plant. So if you look at this picture, this is showing you a monoecious plant. It's got male flowers, it's got female flowers, but they are all on the same plant. So a good example of a monoecious plant is corn. Okay, so in corn, this top part that sticks out the top of the corn plant, that is from the male flower, okay? And then the ear of corn that you eat is from the female flower because the ear of corn is your fruit and the kernels are your seeds. So corn is an example of a monoecious plant because it has male and female flowers on the same plant. Okay, so the other option we can have is we can have a dioecious plant. Okay, so if we go back to our previous slide, remember what our other option here was for our imperfect flowers. We could have male flowers and we could have female flowers on separate plants. Male flowers, female flowers on separate plants. And so that's what we see with the date palm tree. Like dates that you eat, I think it's popular in the Middle East. If you were a date farmer, you would plant a lot of female trees and probably only like one or two male trees just so you could get the pollen because the female trees are the only ones that are going to produce the date fruits. Yesterday we talked a little bit about the ginkgo plant, the ginkgo tree. Ginkgo is also dioecious. You have male trees and female trees. And so because the female trees produce that fruit-like structure that kind of smells, most people just want to plant the male trees because they're really good in like an urban environment. They're very pretty, especially in the fall. And the male ones at least don't produce the stinky fruit-like structure. So ginkgo trees are dioecious as well. All right, so we are going to move on to monocot and dicot structures, and this should help you to be able to tell your monocots and dicots apart for your plant project. So where they get their name from, monocot is short for monocotyledons, and a cotyledon is a seed leaf. It is a nutritive structure inside the seed of a plant. So when you think of a monocot, monocots only have one cotyledon. So I want you to think about a corn kernel, which is what I tried to draw in pink here. Okay, so the corn kernel, if you've ever bitten into a kernel of corn or maybe eaten corn on the cob and you've seen this little white structure inside the kernel, okay, that is the cotyledon. And there's only one of them inside a corn kernel, which makes it a monocot. Okay, if you think about the leaves on a corn plant, they have parallel venation. It's going to be a monocot. Dicots, when I think of dicots, I think of something like a bean. Okay, so this is showing you a bean split in half. And basically the cotyledons are all this nutritive stuff that I've like sort of colored in yellow here that take up, the whole inside of the bean. All right, next is venation. So monocots have parallel venation, which means their veins all run parallel to each other, whereas dicots have branched venation. Okay, I think that's pretty straightforward. So if you take pictures of that for your plant portfolio, make sure it is very clear to me what you're trying to show me. Next is root structure. So this is something that we didn't really get to talk about last week. Monocots have fibrous or branching roots. Okay, which means they don't really have a main central root here. They all just kind of branch out. So if you take a picture of that, make sure it's super clear for me. I should be able to tell, or maybe you'll have to circle it in your picture what you want me to look at. But I should be able to tell from your picture, like, oh, they're showing me fibrous roots here. It should be pretty obvious. Okay, whereas a taproot is going to have one main central structure and then little smaller roots that come off of that. So some of your gymnosperms, even though we're not really talking about gymnosperms here, some of them have taproots. A carrot is a good example of a taproot. Okay, and then flower parts. So monocots have flower parts in multiples of 3. Dicots have flower parts in multiples of 4 or 5, so that's really nothing new for you. Okay, so what's next? Now you don't have these pages, but I just figured we could run through these together and look at the picture and figure out whether it's a monocot or dicot. So here we see parallel venation, so that's going to make this a monocot. Here, it's hard to count how many petals this one has, but I see 1, 2, 3 sepals, and so that's going to also make this a monocot. Here I see branched venation, so that's going to make this one a dicot. Here I see a fibrous or branching root system, so that's going to make this a monocot. This is a taproot, so that's going to make that a dicot. Here it makes sense to count the sepals, so I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sepals, so this would be a dicot. Here I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 petals, so this would also be a dicot. Here I see 6 petals. I also see 6 stamens if you want to count those, but we'll count petals first. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 petals. Or, really you're counting anthers here, but we know anthers have a filament below them. So maybe we'll count stamens. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so those are your 6 stamens. That makes this a monocot. Notice how prominent your stigma of your carpel is in this picture. It's very large, it's very prominent. Here, this is a monocot. It's hard to count the petals here, but I promise you it is. It actually looks like the alstroemeria flower that we normally dissect. So I think that's the only reason I put this in here. You can also tell from the parallel venation in the background. Okay, so that's it for the angiosperm notes. Now I want you to set those aside and get your fruit notes out. We're going to talk about the classification of fruit real quick. All right, so there are 3 categories of fruit that I want you to be aware of. Okay, we've got simple fruit, we've got aggregate fruit, and we've got multiple fruit. So I think you'll find this to be pretty helpful. I think it's interesting, if nothing else, and I'll see if I can find my fruit Kahoot to share with you. You might find that interesting as well. And I know that, we're glad to be home, but sometimes we get a little bored being home too. So I'd like to give you some other things to try if you're interested. All right. So a lot of the fruit that we learn about today is going to be simple fruit, which means it's fruit derived from a single ovary. And then usually simple fruit can be divided into 2 other categories, which is fleshy and dry. So when you think about eating fruit, you are normally consuming fleshy fruit. Dry fruit is a lot of your nuts and things that you maybe, or grains even, that you don't consider fruit, but they still technically are fruit. So let's talk about some categories of simple fruit. So first up, ooh, what did I do? Oh, sorry guys. First up are our pomes. So notice what it says at the top. These are categories of fleshy, simple fruit. So pomes have seeds in a papery ovary, meaning it's got kind of a papery texture to it. The flesh develops from the receptacle of the flower, and examples are apples and pears. So that might just be memorization for now, that you know that apples and pears are pomes. Okay, drupes. What drupes have in common is they've got a hard pit in the middle. Okay, seeds enclosed in a hard pit. So technically a coconut is even a drupe because the coconut itself is the seed. If you've ever seen coconuts, they come with a larger husk type thing around them, and that's the fruit. The coconut that you think of is actually the seed. Okay. Then you have, cherries have a pit in them, peaches obviously have a pit in them, and olives have a pit in them. And then there's some others shown here. Okay, next are your berries. Now, berries is a pretty broad category. This just means that are seeds enclosed in a soft flesh that develops from the ovary wall. I'm more concerned that you understand the category of berries here. So the first category is a Hesperidium. Okay, it's got a leathery exocarp, which is just the outer layer, kind of like the rind. What makes a Hesperidium different from all the other categories is that it has visible partitions. Okay, it's got separation. So you think, okay, what kind of fruit do I eat that has separations, dividers? Okay, an orange, a lemon, a lime, a grapefruit. Okay, most of your citrus fruits are going to be Hesperidiums. Next, my favorite one to say, it's a peepo. Okay, peepos have leathery or woody exocarp. So think about like the pumpkin rind or a watermelon rind. Cucumber's a little different, but again, still kind of leathery as opposed to woody, like a pumpkin rind. No partitions inside. So watermelon, squash, cucumber, or pumpkin. Those are all peepos. All right, then we have a classic berry. And this is not when you say, oh, classic berry, like a strawberry, blueberry. It's not the ones that just have berries in their name. So, for example, a strawberry and a raspberry and a blackberry are going to be aggregate fruits. They are not simple fruits. Therefore, we can't talk about them as classic berries. Okay, they are different. A blueberry may be a classic berry. I would have to look that up. Blueberry might be the only one that's a classic berry. But anyway, so fleshy fruit and fleshy exocarp. So think about something that doesn't really have much of a rind or a peel to it. It's very fleshy. That would be like a grape and a tomato. So grapes and tomatoes are classic berries. All right, then we have categories of dry fruit. So legumes, like peas or beans. Grains, so I know we don't normally think of wheat, rice, and oats as being fruit. Corn you don't think of as a fruit, but I've told you enough times, the corn, the ear of corn is the fruit, and the kernels are the seeds. Nuts, we have walnuts, chestnuts, acorns. We'll talk about what a true nut is. You might learn a little bit about that if I'm able to post your Kahoot later. And then samaras, like the little helicopter things that come off certain trees, those are still dry fruits. So just to give you an idea, and then of course, for it to be a vegetable, it's got to come from the stalk or the stem or the root of a plant or the leaves of a plant. If it's a fruit, it comes from the ovary. That's the definition of a fruit. Comes from the ovary of a flower. All right. So the different categories that we just talked about, those were all related to simple fruits. They come from a single ovary of a single flower. Okay, like this picture that you see down here. Next, we're going to talk about an aggregate fruit. So an aggregate fruit is going to develop from many different ovaries in a single flower. So first up are raspberries and blackberries. So if you look at this, each of the little circles that you see on a raspberry or a blackberry is from an ovary, but the ovaries are all of the same flower, okay? And so how do I know that's an ovary? Well, because the little thing that sticks out that you would call like a hair, that's actually the stigma connected to that ovary. So these ovaries, there's multiple ovaries, but they're part of the same flower. Okay, strawberries are a little bit different. I know I have those in a different flip chart, but the part of the strawberry that you eat is actually the receptacle of a flower. Remember what we said earlier? The receptacle is that swelled region at the base of a flower. Well, that's actually the strawberry that you eat. The leaves that are attached to that, the little green leaves on a strawberry, those are the sepals. Okay, and then people say, oh, but it's got seeds on the outside. Sort of. The things that you would consider the seeds on the outside of a strawberry are actually the fruit. Each of those is a fruit, and inside that fruit is going to be the seed. It's something we call an achene, A-C-H-E-N-E. So again, let me repeat that. The part of the strawberry that you eat is actually the receptacle of the flower. The leaves are the sepals, and the little seeds that you see are actually the fruit themselves. So the seeds are inside those things that you would normally call seeds. So strawberries are kind of fun. Hopefully we'll talk about those another day as well. All right, then we have multiple fruits. Multiple fruits develop from single ovaries of each flower in a cluster. So that can be a little hard to understand. When you look at a pineapple, okay, let me make that a little bit bigger. Each little section, okay, each little section on the outside of a pineapple is from an ovary of a different flower. So when we go back to aggregate fruits, these were each from an ovary on the same flower. Here we're saying with a pineapple, these are from each an ovary of a separate flower. Okay, so that's a flower, that's from a flower, that's from a flower, that's from a flower, that's from a flower. Okay, so ovaries of separate flowers in a cluster, and that's what gives you your pineapple. So if you look here for multiple fruit, you see flower, 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 flower. Flowers each have their own ovary. Okay, whereas this is one flower with many ovaries. That's the difference between an aggregate and a multiple fruit. So, I'm sorry I had to do this again. I'm sorry I'm late posting it. It'll take me a little while to upload it, but at least the video is done for today. Thanks, and I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.